We opened about 6 years ago. We do public events, private, and now online, so thanks for joining. Whether you're painting with me in the studio or at your house, we have 2 rules. The first one is just to have fun. Easy peasy, that's all we're here to do. And the second one is no negativity. That one's a little bit harder since our painting might not look exactly like the example you see up in the left side of your screen there. But whatever you paint, just own it and make it your own. They're all going to look a little different, and mine won't even look exactly like the example. So don't stress over it, just have fun with it. Tonight we're painting the O'Keeffe Poppy, which you can see up there. We're just using a few simple colors. It's going to be a very fun painting. It's relaxed with a lot of shading, and I'll talk you through all of it so it'll go really smoothly tonight. If you have any questions though, throw them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I see them. And if you're here, just say hi. Maybe you don't have a question, just show some excitement and enthusiasm before we get going tonight. So before we paint, get your music, get your snacks, get comfortable. Make sure you're not painting on any carpet or anything like that. And we'll go ahead and get started. So let's check out what we have tonight. If you ordered an art kit to go from us, you probably already know that you have a set of instructions, your paints, maybe you ordered some brushes, and your pre-sketched canvas. Tonight, if you don't have all of these things and you didn't order from us, just do your best to color match. Tonight we're using a dark brown, burnt umber. We're using white, dark blue, pretty bright orange here, and a warm red. So that is all we'll need for tonight. One thing to mention, as you're painting, if you're not familiar with acrylic paints, just remember that acrylics dry very quickly and we don't want them to dry on our brushes. So when you're not using these guys and you have paint on them, keep them in your cup of water. I have mine hiding up here, but always keep your brushes in your water and that'll preserve them longer and so they don't wear out on you. All right, so we're actually going to go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to follow these directions as you can see on here. If you get lost or you fall behind a little bit, just keep following the page. Tonight we have a lot of repetitive painting motions and brush strokes, so don't worry about getting left behind. You're just going to keep going along at your own pace, and I'll keep it slow so everyone can keep up together. So first of all, I'm going to start with my orange, my white, and my red. I'm not even going to uncap my brown and my blue yet. That's for later. So for tonight's painting, it's important that we work from back to front. This is because if we make little mistakes up here, well, mistakes, if we go outside of the lines a little bit where we don't want them to be, we can always cover it. With acrylic paint, as soon as it dries, you can cover it with another layer of paint, which is super convenient. So I'm going to start back here on these petals and pull my paint forward, and then we'll finally paint the background last and these small little dark details. For most of the petals, we're going to be using just orange and white, and then we will add in some of the darker values with this beautiful warm red. To begin, we're going to paint the darker areas of the petals first. I'm going to start way back here by using mostly just orange, filling this in, and then I'll add some water and fill in the rest as I go. So to keep these colors nice and blended tonight and not get too chunky and separated, I'm going to add a little bit of water to my brush as I go. Not a lot because it will start to run and thin the paint. So you'll just have to play around with the ratio of water you want. But what I'm going to do first is scoop some white onto my plate. A plate is definitely helpful so that you have a paint palette and you don't contaminate all of your paints by mixing colors in the cup. So way off to the right here you can see my little paint palette. So I'll throw some white on the plate and then wash your brush off really well so you don't get white in all of your orange, since we'll be using a lot of it tonight. Scoop some orange onto your plate. Okay, so I have my 2 starting colors here, and then I'll come back in and add red in a little bit. But for right now, I'm going to map out my darker area of my back petal. When we start this, don't go too crazy and paint all the petals at once. We're just doing one at a time. This will make sure that our paint stays wet on the petal we're focusing on, and it will make all of your colors blend together really nicely. So if you ordered a kit from us, you have a more rounded brush and you have a more rectangular brush. I'm using the rounded brush for now. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the darker area of my flower. So there's a little bit of a shadow where this little dip is. And I'm going to try to follow that the best I can and just butt it up right next to the petal below it. And then, as you can see in the example up in the corner of your screen, there are all of these small little shadows coming in, and they're actually just in the low points of those waves along the edge. So I'm going to pull a little one in here, and in there, and through here. Okay, so those are most of my dark values. I have my shadows made, and now I'm going to add a little bit of white to some orange. Mix that color up. I'm going to cover most of the petal around those dark values. So I'll come in and just fill this in. You can already see my paint's getting a little bit thin, so I'm just going to add more paint to my brush rather than so much water. I still want to cover these pencil lines and really make sure that my paint covers all of my canvas. And I'll just butt it up right next to this dark orange. I want them to touch so they blend together and there's not a really big difference between the two or a huge line separating the two colors. Now you can see they just blend together very nicely. The trick to doing these petals is making sure you add all of these colors while the paint is still wet. So, like I said, adding a little bit of water will definitely prolong the drying process, and that will make your life a lot easier tonight. So right now I'm mostly just filling in the rest with this white and orange mixture. Since I've mapped out my shadows a bit, it's getting a little bit light, so I'm going to come back in and add in some orange. And it is okay if you overlap some of your petals that are a little bit closer. Like I said, we'll go back over those with some other paint, and it won't be a problem at all. I'll darken a few more areas, making a little bit brighter orange. I'm trying to move a little bit quickly so that my paint doesn't dry, because I am doing a very thin coat right now. Okay. And this painting isn't perfectly smooth. If you look very closely, you can see that there's a lot of little brush strokes that you can see throughout the petal. So you can see a lot of darker orange down a little bit lower. So actually, as you get closer to this petal just in front of it, it's just a tiny, tiny bit darker than the tips of the petals. Most of our petals tonight have more white at the ends for a highlight and get darker as you move toward the center of the flower, since that's where the shadow is. So I've lost my shadows a little bit that I initially marked. Now I'm going to put my rounded brush back in my cup of water, take my smaller flat brush, and I'm going to scoop out some red. Now this red is very bright, and I'm going to mix a little bit of it with my orange, making something that's a little bit darker than what I have and more intense. And I'm just going to go back over these shaded areas and make them pop a little bit more. If you're finding that it's blending in too much, we can always revisit these shaded areas and add in more of a shadow as our paint starts to dry. That will just make it pop a little bit more and make it more vibrant. And I also want to add some shadow just along the edge. And I'm only using red right now. And I'm just blending it into the already wet orange paint that I have. Very subtle, but just enough of a difference to show that there is some shade in there. Some shading. Okay. I'm just starting down by the petal in front and pulling some paint up into the orange. Just a little bit. There you can see we have some nice color changes in there. Okay. I'm going to come back in with some orange and a little bit of white. And like I said, the tips of most of our petals are a little bit brighter. They're catching more of the light. And I'll just highlight them a tish more. I'm not going to get too close to the shadowed edges. I'm just going to put a few little highlights in between. Just like that. And it might not look like much of anything right now. If you look at it, you're like, kind of looks like a strange fish fin. As we go, I promise it will start to look like a flower. Okay, now I'm going to switch back to my larger round brush. I'm happy with that petal, so I'm going to move on to this outer petal. Since this one's technically behind this large centerpiece, we're going to paint all of these edges. You always want to paint from back to front with acrylics so it looks like it's layered on top of itself. If we were to go with the middle, this might look like it's falling behind these petals back here, and it would be kind of confusing to the eye. So again, I'm just going to go in with only orange and fill in my darker areas. If I look at my reference photo, up in the top corner, I see that there is a dark patch here in a kind of a little triangle. There's a little line that swoops down here, and I'm just kind of mentally mapping this out where I want everything to go. A little bit of dark along this edge, and those are about all of the darker areas that I can see. So I'm going to come in and just fill those in. So the shadows tonight are all different kinds of shapes. So one thing that kind of helps me for a painting like this is actually looking at my reference photo and squinting a little bit. So I can look at it and see, oh, that's where that dark blob is. Don't think of it as a flower petal. Think of it as a dark shape. Look at what that shape is and then try to create that on your flower here. We're really just making different color blocked shapes that we're not super familiar with. They don't teach you to draw that when they're teaching you your shapes in kindergarten. But here's a fun new one for you. And then my next one just kind of swoops in. It's like a very gradual little curve. And it doesn't go all the way to the bottom of this petal. It stops about 3/4 of the way down. So to make it very thin like that, I'm going to turn my brush sideways, just do one big swoop. And remember, we're going to be blending this with other colors, right? So don't worry if it's not the exact shape you were hoping for or as thin as you wanted, because you're going to pull in some other light colors and fade it a bit. And then there's also a dark blob right here. It comes out toward me a bit. And comes back down to the bottom. This one almost reaches the bottom of that petal. Okay. And then there's a little bit along the edge here. I'm just going to pull the paint in like that. All we're doing is color blocking. Nothing too crazy yet. There's a little bit of dark in here, so I'm going to just pull a very thin line of paint just here. One thing that I will mention now, since this petal overlays and overlaps on the edges of our canvas, I like to paint the edges of my canvas. If you've painted with me before, you definitely have heard this already. I think it makes the painting look more complete. So if you'd like, just carry the colors that you're using all the way over the edge of the canvas, which is what I'm going to do, just to really finish it. The trickiest part is remembering to continue this with the whole painting, because as you go along, it gets more difficult to make these colors if you forget and you have to go back. Okay, my paint is still wet. Awesome, I'm going to continue on. So I'll get most of the orange off my brush, come back in and mix some orange and white, just like we did up in here to make that intermediate color, and really fill in the rest of the space. Don't panic too much about what shade this is, since we'll be able to tweak it as we go. But I'm just going to actually fill in the rest of my space with this, making sure that I overlap with those dark values. I'm putting about half of my brush into that dark color and letting them mix together, and continuing to the edge of my canvas and beyond. You can see if I drag my brush along that dark shadow that it just very lightly disappears into the light colors there, just like that. I'm going to throw a little bit more white in to add some variation. And this petal really has a variation of darker orange and lighter. So as I'm going, I might put more white right in this here, in this brush stroke. And then put a little bit more orange back into one that's in the center, like that. So there's some differences in my colors. I'm adding highlights and lowlights as I go. I'm going to make it a little bit darker as I get closer to this middle piece, since that part would be more shaded by the flower petal in front of it. And all I'm doing is adding a touch more orange to that. Carefully following the edge. Okay. Same thing, I'll keep that lighter color. And it's actually even a touch lighter up here than it is back here, just because more light is hitting it. So I'll add a little more white. If your paints are drying, it's not a bad idea to clean your brush off and go back over those dark areas with just orange so that you can kind of re-wet that surface and it will blend more nicely. Like you can see there, this is already dried, so it's not blending as nicely as I'd like it to. So I'll show you how I'm going to fix that. This part isn't blending at all. So I'll just clean my brush off, take orange, go back over that existing line, and now I can blend again with the light colors coming along the edge of it. There we go, and we have a shadow. That's the hardest part, is trying to keep up with your paints as they dry. I'm going to put more orange over this darker patch because just like the other shadow, already dry. So you're probably starting to figure out that this is very repetitive. And we're really just using the same technique all the way around the flower. Now for this part here, my shadow, I'm going to kind of pull it up into my lighter colors just by going the same direction with my brush. I don't want to create too much of a difference in the direction of my brush strokes. I want them to all go the same way and just pull the colors together. I'm using the very tip of my brush to do this. Now I'll just kind of scribble along the edges and pull the colors together. Okay. And this dark shadow here that connects with my long skinny line, it sticks out a little bit more toward the top and it juts a little further left. That will really make the flower petal appear like it's curving in, so I'm going to pull just a touch more orange up this direction. And for this bit, I'm just going to make sure that my orange shadow comes down and touches the petal just in front of it. Right here, it butts up right against that. So right here, my colors weren't blending together very well, so I'm just doing small scribbling motions to get them to connect a little bit better. And then pulling those colors back in the same direction I wanted them to go. And there they blend nicely. So this part is quite flat. It's getting a little bit too white. So I'll just come back in with my orange. And like I said, this is just a variation of light and dark to make all of those tiny, tiny shadows and wrinkles in the petals. So I'll just pull some orange in here. I'm just going to do a few brush strokes, starting at the edge of my petal and making it thinner as I go down till it almost disappears, just like that. And now I have a small, subtle wrinkle. Do that again over here. And you don't want them to be the exact same size or equidistant from each other. They're kind of random. And you can just follow the example picture up in the corner. And there's a little bit of a shadow up in here. And there's actually one almost between the two that I'm going to follow along with and go all the way down to the bottom of my flower. Okay, so I have most of my colors blocked out, and I'm really liking where this is heading right now. To make it just a touch darker, I'm going to go back in with red. So, clean off your small rectangular brush again. I find that I have more control with this one, that's why I like to switch to this for the finer shadows. I'll mix a tiny bit of orange in with some red. Perfect, I've got the color that I want. And then it's darkest down here where the petal connects with the base of the flower. And also up in this corner here, which is where I'm going to make them pop a little bit more. It's okay if your orange is a bit more dry for this step. I think it's actually easier to add the more kapow shadows when this base layer has dried. So my orange down here is pretty dry. And now I'm going to throw in some red. Just following the shadow I already have. This doesn't have to completely color the orange you already have, and I'm not even going all the way up to the edge because I want this orange to really slowly fade into the lighter orange. So I'm just putting a little bit of red plus orange toward the base of this shadow. And I'll let it come up a little bit. It's going to creep up into this area. And if you look closely, you can see there's a pretty dark line through the center of this big main shadow that we painted right away when we were color blocking. I'm going to make sure that I don't have a lot of rogue paint on the edges of my brush. I'm going to wipe most of it off so I have a very thin line just on the tip. And I'm going to follow the very center of this piece, of this dark shadow, down. And right now I'm using only red to make it a little bit darker. This is a very fine line, so take your time. And you can see how dark that is relative to the rest. We don't want to do this with every shadow. It's just for a few of the deeper wrinkles in the petals. And I'm also going to try to let it taper off and slowly come to a stop about 3/4 of the way down that line. Now I have some dark values up back here as well. And I can fill in most of this with red. Okay, and then a little bit down in this very bottom edge. And I'm still remembering to finish my flower off on the edge of my canvas. Since I've already started that, might as well complete my painting. Throw a little bit of red in here. Okay. I want to darken up a couple areas still, so I'll just come back in with orange. Now we're really tweaking the colors. You have your highlights and your lowlights laid out perfectly. And once you have that mapped out, you can come back in, and now my paint is dry, so if it's dry, remember it won't blend as well. I'm just taking very little paint on my brush and maybe darkening just a few of those areas. Again, using only orange here. They're not as dark as that deep red, which is what we're shooting for, and it'll add a little bit different depth. You can see I'm just adding a few stripes in here. Okay, and this part is quite a bit lighter, so I'll take some orange, just pull a little bit up from the red. Try not to cover all of your beautiful highlights that you spent so long on. Keep most of them in there, just add a few little darker areas in if you'd like. And we will come back in with some brown and some darker colors, so don't worry too much about this getting super dark with a lot of really strong shadows. That will come later. But this is a very good start for where we'd like to be. And then you might want to accentuate some of your highlights. So now I have all of my dark values that I want on this petal. I'm going to take a tiny bit of white and orange. And by that I mean just hardly any paint on my brush since my petal is dry. And I'm going to add even a few more little highlights like in here. I'm just going to scribble some white there. And there's one thin one up here that I'd like to show a little more. Just a little bit down in here. It's not taking very much white. It's just to catch, just to show where a little bit of the light is catching, just like that. Okay, how are we all doing? Post in the comments if you're keeping up, if you're liking how we're cruising along here. Let me know what you think. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with this petal so far, and there's a little bit of a glare on my red paint here, so it does look a little bit darker in person. As soon as that dries, you guys will be able to see that. All right, now I'm going to move on to my next section. Now this big part in the middle here is what we're going to tackle. This petal over here overlays this one, so I'd like to paint the one that's further back first. We're going to just work on this big middle chunk back here. We're going to just focus in on that. So just like always, take your round brush and only orange, filling in the dark areas. So I have some dark along the top edge here that wraps around and comes just inside of this petal here, just inside the edge. And then I also have some darks that come up from the center about halfway up the petal, maybe 3/4. So really just stop and look at the shapes before you put paint to canvas. Strongly recommend it. Helps a lot. So my dark color up here starts just to the right of the peak of this little petal. So I'm going to start here and then work my way right. If you go outside of these lines, don't worry either. Our background blue is going to kind of clean that up. Since my orange paint was drying so fast last time, I'm adding a little bit more, so it's just a touch thicker. You really just have to play around with how much paint you need to keep it wet for long enough. And make sure this color is touching the petal behind it. You want them to butt up to each other so we don't have any white between petals. You can actually see, if you look closely, there's a very thin, light colored edge, so I'm going to avoid just a touch of it right there. And I'm going to come in with a lighter color. So being very mindful of that line, I'm going to continue all the way down to the middle of my flower. Okay, so my top edge is good. That's dark enough. Now I'm going to come from here and work my way up. The strokes that we're using go from bottom to top, so I'm just swooping them up and really mapping out that area. And the darker color does come to just above this line here. And tapers down a little bit to the right. And you can see as we get toward the middle here, these dark values get closer. So I'm actually going to pull this up just a little bit higher. And then we'll fill in the rest and make them meet with our lighter values, our kind of intermediate. Okay, so that's good. Now I'm going to clean my brush off again, come back in with orange and white, making that pretty light color that we can always darken later, and fill in the rest. Be sure to let those colors overlap while it's still wet, just like you've most likely been doing on the rest of your flower. Really pull them together. Okay, so those are pretty separated. And I want a little bit more dark, so I'm going to just come back in with orange and pull those together. Make this a touch higher. Don't be afraid to let the colors kind of bleed into each other. So I'm really scribbling quite a ways up into this white and then pulling it way back down into the orange. And to make it blend more smoothly, I'm pulling strokes up into the lighter color, and they're uneven. There's not just a solid straight line all the way across. And the same with the top. I don't want to completely make these two colors meet, these two dark values meet, so make sure you leave a little gap. If they do happen to meet, come back in with white and scribble some white in. Okay, now you can see it looks like a really bright highlight on my leaf, on my petal, instead of just looking like one big block of line. I'll pull a little bit of orange, of that darker orange up in here. So this petal might seem a little bit intimidating, but really it's just two large shadows and not too many small details. So we'll cruise through this one. I'm going to switch to my smaller brush here that's rectangular to do this small highlight along the right that I talked about earlier. That will be the same color that we used through the middle section here. And I'm just going to very carefully follow this edge. This is just the very lip of the flower. It doesn't have to be a perfectly straight line either. I'm making it wiggle and wobble a little bit as I go. So it looks like it folds in. And then it's just going to taper off very subtly when it gets up to the top, right there on that edge. And then it disappears just in this area here. Okay. So to make that look a little bit more convincing, we're going to deepen our shadows. And I'll clean my brush off and come back in with red. My shadow's considerably darker just along this edge, and it comes all the way up to here and comes all the way down to the center of my flower. If it's standing out too much against the orange, throw some orange in there. I want this shadow to be pretty dark, so I'm using only red right now. This one's pretty dramatic. This is at the center of the flower where there's not as much light, so my shadows are getting deeper and darker. And then I'll add a little bit, not very much red, but just some, kind of in the middle of this orange in the top. Just a few random strokes. And then some more red closer to the bottom of my lower half. And I'm just pulling up. I want all of my strokes to go the same way. The petals flowing this way. If that red gets too intense and you're like, man, that's popping out way too much, put some orange back in. Promise you'll fix it. So I think it got a little bit intense. Now watch this. Just come back in with some orange, clean brush, and I just pull those together. If it's still too intense, throw some white in there, just a touch. If you're like, wow, those are not bridging as nicely as I thought. Now we can just pull them all back together, calm it down a little bit. Okay, I have all my dark values. Now I'm going to come back in and do a couple of my light ones. I covered my highlighted just a touch, so I'll come back in with just orange and white. Scribble a little bit of that in here. And make it come over just a touch. The highlight can be lighter in some areas and darker in others. That'll make it more successful. You can see it pops a little more in the middle and then fades out on either side. I want it to pop a little bit more over here, so I'll add just a touch more of white. And you can see there's some variation in the shades. Then I'll add a few thin white highlights traveling up this direction. Okay. And that is about how much I'd like to do for this petal. The next part that we're going to move on to is this petal here. It covers this one, and then this one will overlay here. So we're really just layering, just kind of paying attention to what's behind other petals and what overlaps where. This petal is continuous almost with this one way back, and we're just going to kind of make them as one. Although there are two separate ones. I'll show you how to make it distinctly different with some highlights. Okay. There we go. And now the same steps just like before. I'm going to fill this in with my flat brush or my round brush and orange. I see that I have some dark along this top edge, and it really loops in, follows this edge, and then curves back down. Then that's pretty much the extent of my dark colors in here. Then I have a very dark, dramatic shadow that separates the two front petals. That is what I want to focus on right now. So as you're filling this in, just be careful not to cover the lip of your flower. That little tiny highlight is really going to separate this petal from this petal. It's easy to lose in there because it is so light, so just be mindful of it as you come across it. Okay, there are all of my dark values. Now you know the drill. We're going to come back in with white and orange. Fill all of this in. Okay, so now if you remember back to over here on this far side where we had all of these very thin orange lowlights and shadows, we're going to put that over on this petal as well. There's a few more of those in here. They're very, very subtle, but there's a couple that come down from the very edge and just work their way down. So I'm going to add a few orange strokes of paint. They're getting kind of thick, but I can blend them back in. So if I go along the edge, voila, blend them in just a touch on either side. There, you can hardly see it, but it's just subtle enough where you can tell. And I'll throw one in here. And then my shadows are going just diagonally at first, and then they almost seem to come down to about this point here. So they get a little bit shorter, and they pull down to this edge, like that. That's because these are two separate petals. This one here, like I mentioned before, has this darker shadow right here. That petal is in front and there's one just behind it. So the colors are very similar. We can do these tones all at once, but we will separate them with that red and it'll become more apparent that they're two separate. So I'm going to make this back right one ever so slightly lighter. And I hope you can already see this here on camera, that this edge is creating a distinct line between the two, where it's more white, just like that. So you can kind of separate them that way. And then when we come in and add these very dark umber colors, then it will really pop and become obvious. Okay. So I have my lighter values back there done. This is a very simple petal in the back. Not a lot of differences in color. Here's where the fun part begins, because we're going to add in all this very dark red. So I'll switch brushes again using my little flat brush and red. And this red has a pretty unique shape. It's following the edge, and it's pretty thick right here where this little peak pops up. And it pulls down quite a ways, and then it tapers off as you move up. It gets very, very skinny and disappears. Just like that. Now I'm going to work my way down around this part of the flower. It's also going to taper off a little bit, and it's not going to taper off just along the edge. It really pulls down into the petal and gets thin. And I hardly have any paint on my brush right now. So my paint's getting a little thin. I'm going to spread it out how I want it to dry, and I'm going to let that shadow dry and come back to it so it can really pop out and go kapow and stand out more. And then it also pulls down a ways onto the petal here. And there's a very, very thin line separating that light white that we made and this front petal. So I'll drag some red paint along the edge of it and curve it in toward the bottom. So right now I'm mapping out all of the dark areas. If you look, you can see that there will be brown right here. There will be a little strip of brown. I'm going to keep that red just so I have a guideline for right now. So if your red gets a little bit thicker, that's okay. We're going to cover a small section of that as we go on. And that's where my brown is going to be. There's a lot of red just along this left edge here. And I'll pull some of that red up into here. I'm going to keep this paint pretty thick. This shadow's dark. This one's very, very dark. And it's thicker, even thicker paint just near the edge, like so. And then it thins out as we go further into the orange. I'm liking the look of that shadow, so I'll leave it how it is there. And then pull a couple strokes of red just along the edge here with some thinner red paint. So the edge of that last petal that we painted up here kind of runs in to one that you can see up along this edge as well. So I'm just going to continue with that intermediate orange and white color, same brush, and follow along the very top edge and make a super, super thin edge to my petal there. And it's not going to follow the entire thing, it just tapers off a bit. There's also a very subtle highlight way down here in this corner, in this little valley. Okay, now that one's very bright. I'm going to come in with a bit more orange and just blend it out a touch so it's not just jumping out at us. There you go, it's more subtle. And I'll do that in both places. I'm going to revisit this area up here that I was like, whoa, this is not spreading well. And I'm going to put some more red. It's not as dramatic as I was hoping it would be, so I'll come back in, just make it pop a little bit more. So, it's very, very dark along this edge. Remember, your edges are squiggly. These flowers don't have perfectly smooth petals. So follow the wave and keep it darkest right up next to the edge of the petal. I'm going to scribble in a little more red and try to bridge these two darker areas. And then some orange. Now in doing that, I've gotten rid of a lot of my highlights. So just like before, to really finish this petal off, I'll come back in with some white and just a little bit of orange, hardly any at all, and scribble in the tiniest of highlights where I got rid of them. Not very many, very subtle, but they're effective in separating them. Now I'm also going to add a touch of dark to this back petal since there would be a shadow along it, and I'll just take orange for that and go along that line that I created and just pull it up into the flower. Just like that. Very subtle, but just enough to separate the two. I might even throw in just a touch of red right here along the lowest point and pull that up to separate. Now you can see there's a difference in where they start and where they stop. Right now I'm really just working on blending out those fine details, making sure my colors pull together. Okay, I'm liking those petals. So now I'm going to move on to the next bit, and that is this side here. Just going to overlap this chunk here. Back to the round brush, and repeat. My darkest values come from the bottom of this petal. There are hardly any dark values in this petal. It's very bright, but it just takes a little bit of orange, and the rest will be mostly white plus orange. And that is really all I need for this bit. Now the white comes in. And ever so slightly overlaps our other petal that we had painted. It's pretty light here over on the far left side, so I'll add a really thin strip of white to really lighten that up a lot. There we go. And just keep blending that back and forth till I get the right color I want. And it's also very bright up along these top edges where it's ripply. So I'm going to make it very dramatic right now and then come back in with my dark values and do a little bit of color fixing. But for now, there we go. Got my dramatic highlights. Now I'll come back in with just orange and add some strokes as we go. They really follow this curve. So if you pay attention to your left curve, it's going to come up and taper off to the left. The trick with making these little waves look like they're indenting in and out is paying attention to where you put the darker values. So my dark values are mainly on the left side of it, so you can see that this one will come up and it will go on the low point of my wave. And it curves in ever so slightly and just pulls back down into those darker values. So now when I add the second one, it'll leave just the smallest little gap of white where I was before. And now you can see it looks like that one is indenting. Just curving the back of that one slightly also. And continue that pattern all the way down. So only put your dark shadowy parts just in the dips of those waves. And now you can see it really looks like they're waving. And I'll do one more right here. And it leaves just a tiny little triangle of light at the top. They almost look like little teeth if you look closely. And now you will probably never unsee that, and you'll always see teeth in your flower. So I'll throw some more orange in here. Make it darker as I work my way down. So you guys will have to be sure to post these pictures in the Facebook group so we can see what you made. I'm sad I don't get to see them in studio, but hopefully I can check them out online. And if you guys are done painting at home and you're ready to get out of the house, we will be hosting in-studio events. So go ahead and check our calendar. If you are interested, would you please comment, yes, I'm interested. We're just curious about how many people are ready to come back into our studio. We miss you all, and we love to see you back here. So if you think you're ready to come and paint outside of your house, let us know. We want to get excited about letting our customers come back. Alright, so this bit of the flower actually doesn't have any red. I'm not going to add any red to it. There's nothing that requires that much shadow. I will switch to my smaller brush though, my more rectangular one, just to add in a few more little detailed highlights. So I've got a pretty light edge. And I'm just going to go along here with the very corner of my brush and a little bit of white, mostly white, and follow that line. Very subtle. And it's kind of incomplete. It's not going to cover the entire edge. I just put it in a few areas. Also very bright along this left side. And just down at the bottom before this dips away and hides behind the other petals. I'll throw in a few lighter values here. In the middle, just scribbling. Alright, and there you have it. There's your front petal out of all of those. One thing to do to make it look a little bit more convincing, like it is overlapping this guy, is actually to put a bit of orange just here along the edge. It is a little darker at the meeting point between the two colors. So I'll just put a little more orange in there and actually overlap some of the red. My paint got a little bit thin, so I might have to come back in later and add in another layer of orange, since it actually ended up looking a touch lighter. But that's okay. I'll revisit that later. After I'm completely finished adding highlights here, I'll walk my way over to this far right. Okay. I'm just going to follow this dark edge here with only orange again. And this one goes all the way down to the bottom and butts up to the petal below it. So it pops up just along this edge here. And I'm going to complete my petal on the edge of my canvas, just like before. And then come in and bridge the gap. So my petal's a little bit darker as I get down here, so I'll just come back in with more orange. You can see it got a little bit light. And again, I'm just pulling a few of those orange streaks up from the corner, like I did before. Add in some depth. And then finally, to make this one darker, again, some red with my smaller brush. So it's very dark right here, out at the front, to make that pretty obvious. Okay, and my paint's a little bit wet, so I'm going to thin it out again. It's just getting clumpy, so I'll just have to be a little bit more patient with this area. And then I'll come back in later, but I'll add the red in along this edge. So this edge also has a very dark red all the way to the bottom. I'm going to pull that up into my dark orange. Even up in the middle a bit, but I'm going to mix orange in there too to tame the red just a touch. And then leave it very bright out at the edges here. Just like that. Since this piece here is not overlapping any of the other petals, then I'm going to come and move on, just for the sake of time, and we're going to move on to this front petal, and then I'll come back and fill in this dark area. So again, making my dark areas first, only orange, and this top piece of the petal is our darkest. This is the most shaded. Try to leave all of those waves in there. And then just let the petal spill off the canvas. Just like that. And there's just a touch of this darker orange down on the bottom, like that. So this petal gets very small. I'm going to switch to my smaller brush so I have more control. Now I'll come in with white and orange. And my paint is drying on my plate here, so I'll have to mix up a new batch. Fill all of this in. I'm going to scribble using the corner of my brush. Make that intermediate color. And then pull that dark orange up into the light. So now that white really overpowered the orange. Come back in with just orange. Pull it up again. It likes to disappear. Now this front bit is going, it's kind of missing in there, it's getting lost. So to make it more dramatic, we're going to add in some red. But I am going to let it dry just a touch so we don't run into the same problem as over here. However, while we wait for that to dry, I can hop back over to this petal that needs some more attention. And it's almost dry, so I'll come back in and add in some red again. And that spreads much more nicely now that I've given it a couple minutes. Okay, so there's my red. Now I'll come back in, and this little bit of the petal is going to be pretty dark. Fill in this final section here. And then we're mostly done with our flower petals. This petal extends a little bit over to the left and flows down that way. And I have quite a bit of paint on here, so I'm just going to pull some off, wipe it on my paper towel, and then re-blend that section. Okay, so I like how the front of my flower turned out. I'm happy with it. And I'm going to move on to the next step. I'm completely done painting my petals. If you're not, that is a-okay. I'm just going to show the next part. So now we're going to add that dark brown. And our instructions say that we're going to fill in all of these little darker areas. There's not many of them, and this part should go pretty quickly. But I'm going to dip into the burnt umber here. And it will be best if this little piece here is dry. So I'm going to start with the bit that I painted very first. I'm sure it's dry. And there's just this small curved area right in here where we have a little dark area. You don't want to overdo it. This is just the smallest of shadows. I'm going to have hardly any paint on my brush, so I can really control where it's going. And I'll just touch the edge of my brush down first and follow that curve till it reaches the base of the flower. There's hardly any paint, and it's just a very thin line. That's all I need on that side. Then I'll go over to the right and do the same. I kind of marked this one with dark red, if you remember. And I'm just going to fill that area in with this dark brown. And the trick to making the shadow end is just to make it very, very skinny at the ends. It just tapers off. You can't even really see where it goes off to. And this does not take much paint at all, since we've been using such bright, vibrant colors. So there's my thin little shadow, and I'm going to make it taper off all the way down at the edge where these two connect. I had a little bit of trouble trying to decide, which one's in front here. It's hard to see. So I'm going to just take the smallest amount of brown and do the smallest little edge that I can between these two. Teeny tiny. And wow, that makes a difference, doesn't it? It really shows that there's a shadow on the right side and makes them pop. Now for the middle part of the flower, you really want to be careful here. Try not to get any brown over the paint that you already have down for these front petals. Like I said, we normally do back to front. I'm breaking my own rules here. So I'm going to fill this little middle piece in last. So really, you just have to be super careful with your lines here. My paint is very thin, so I'll have to come back in and do a second coat. Be patient with your paint. If you can see through it, don't panic and start adding a bunch more, because it might get kind of gloppy. So I'm actually going to pull some of this off with my clean brush, just like that. I've got a good base coat down. Now I'm just going to give that a few minutes, let it dry, and I'll come revisit it. But now while I'm waiting, I can work on the stem. Same color. I'll just fill in this tiny little area, and I'll likely have to do the same thing. let it dry, and come back. And my stem actually pulls up just a tiny bit to the base of my flower. So it's going to extend out a little bit like that, and I'm going to do very short little strokes upward toward the orange with the very corner of my brush. Not the entire thing, just the corner. Little scribbles that are uneven. I'll make it a touch higher on the side so it really looks like a bowl shape coming around the bottom of the flower. Okay. Now I'll come back in again with my dark brown. And I'm going to do short little strokes, kind of wiggling out to the edge to make the center of my flower uneven. Kind of poofy looking. And I'm only doing the top half of the middle. I'm really focusing on the top half more. Try to get that all squiggly and perfect, make my paint thick enough, and then move down. Okay, so the center of my flower is pretty flat and the rest is very highlighted and vibrant. I'm just going to take a touch of white, mix it with my brown on my plate. It should still be pretty dark, but there needs to be a little bit of difference between your dark brown and the color you've mixed. Hopefully you can see that there's a significant difference there. And now I'm going to go along the middle and do little scribbly white and brown lines just in the very center and have them pull out toward the edges. And it's going to taper off and stay dark down by the very bottom of that center of the flower. I'll use that same color and go along the middle of my stem and then put some dark along the edges of it, just around the sides, so it adds a small little highlight in the middle there. Okay. Once you have done all of that, and you can absolutely take more time if you have to, you are completely done with your flower. And the last thing to do is to fill in the background. So this is where we clean up any lines where we might have gone outside the lines of our flower. I got a little bit of paint up here and made my edges somewhat jagged. I'm going to uncap my blue, some white, and clean off my brushes super well. Now this does not take much blue at all. This blue, if you ordered our art kit, the blue that we gave you is very overpowering and will quickly take over all of the white paint that you add. So it doesn't take much at all. I actually put a pretty generous amount on my plate. And I'll add a lot more white than I have blue. Just dip your brush in it. We want this to be really, really faint blue. Almost lighter than sky blue. Okay, now that I have my subtle baby blue, I'm going to come in and just fill in everything around my flower. You can absolutely adjust the background if you want it a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. That's up to you. It's your preference. But I like mine very light to the point where you can almost not even see that there's blue in there at all. Just ever so carefully come along the edge of your petals. If they're wet, I'd say give it a few minutes, but this is just your final step. If they're wet, you're going to end up pulling some reds and oranges into your background. To avoid that, just be patient. If you would like to expedite the process, you can go grab a hairdryer and just put it on high for a few seconds, maybe even a few minutes, and it'll dry the acrylic paint up very nicely. Otherwise, just blow on it or wave your plate over it. Acrylic dries very quickly, which I'm sure you already know by the end of this painting. So you can hardly tell there's even any blue there. You want to make it the same color throughout, so make sure you mix enough before you start tackling the background, because if you have to mix a new blue, there might be a pretty obvious difference between a section like this and a section over here. Feel free to go back and add in any highlights or lowlights you think your flower might need. But I'm pretty happy with what I've got, so I don't think I'll go back and tweak anything at all. All right, and there you have it, the O'Keeffe Poppy. So if you guys liked this video and you want to see more, you can absolutely go check out patreon.com. It's patreon.com, and type in Creatively Uncorked. That's where you're going to find a ton of videos that we pre-record in the studio. They're videos that you've never seen on Facebook or our YouTube. They're things that you will not find or have access to without being a Patreon member. So go check that out if you're interested. If you subscribe, you will have access to a ton of videos that you can paint along to at your own leisure. Also, go check out our virtual art kits. You can download any template that you want, and you can transfer it to a canvas using your supplies and paint along to these videos. So go check out our website. It's super fun. And thank you guys for joining me. Bye.